In the winter of 1980, a young engineering student pried open a manhole cover on a busy Brooklyn street and lowered himself down into the dark. The traffic kept moving above him. Buses, delivery trucks, people walking to work with coffee in their hands, and not one of them had any idea that a few feet under their shoes there was a doorway. Bob Diamond crawled on his hands and knees through a gap barely wide enough for his shoulders, breathing dust that had not been disturbed in over a century. And then the space around him opened up, the walls pulled back, the ceiling arched high over his head. He was standing inside a tunnel, a massive stone and brick tunnel, longer than 7 football fields, laid end to end, running dead straight beneath the streets of one of the most mapped, photographed, and documented cities on Earth. And almost nobody alive knew it was there. Officially, it did not exist. There was no sign marking it. No record an ordinary person could walk into a library and find. No mention on the transit maps. No plaque on the sidewalk. Nothing in living memory. The city had spent 119 years behaving as though this place had simply never been built. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. But it had been built. Someone had cut a half-mile passage through solid ground using hand tools and lantern light, lined it with masonry, run trains through it for years, and then sealed it shut and allowed the entire world to forget. So the question Bob Diamond was standing inside of, there in that cold and silent dark, is the same question we are going to sit with for the next half hour. It is not really how do you build something like this. It is how on earth do you lose it. To understand what was buried under Atlantic Avenue, you first have to understand the Brooklyn that built it, because it is not the Brooklyn you are picturing. In the 1840s, Brooklyn was not a borough of New York City. It was its own city, and it was growing at a speed that frightened the people living through it. Picture the waterfront back then, a forest of ship masts crowding the East River, warehouses stuffed with sugar and coffee and cotton, the constant noise of barrels rolling, men shouting, and ferries churning back and forth across the water to Manhattan, because there was no bridge yet, no tunnel for people, nothing but boats. This was one of the busiest edges of the entire American economy. And all of that cargo, every last crate of it, had to move. There was an even bigger prize on the table. The dream was a fast connection between New York and Boston, and one of the routes ran a train the length of Long Island to a ferry that carried passengers the rest of the way. Shave hours off that trip and you could pull the two greatest cities in the Northeast closer together than anyone had ever managed. That was the pot of gold the Long Island Railroad was chasing, and fortunes were being made and lost on the waterfront in a single afternoon over exactly these kinds of bets. Everyone with money and ambition understood one thing. Whoever controlled the fastest route in and out of New York Harbor would control an enormous amount of trade. The railroad was the future, and in 1840s America, the future was worth fighting dirty for. But the first, most stubborn obstacle standing in the way was a single crowded stretch of Brooklyn called Atlantic Avenue. The railroad wanted a straight, fast line running out from the ferry landings on the waterfront, and Atlantic Avenue was a problem. It was a busy street, and steam locomotives roaring down the middle of it at ground level were setting fires, spooking horses, and crushing anyone unlucky enough to wander into the way. So the railroad made a decision that, even today, sounds almost impossibly bold. They would put the train underground. They would dig a tunnel straight down the middle of the avenue, drop the tracks below the surface, and let the city keep growing right over the top of it. Now here is where the story starts to bend, because they did not spend a decade doing it. They did not roll in some vast army of modern machines, because those machines did not exist yet. They dug that tunnel, by most accounts, in about 7 months. Think about that for a second. No hydraulic excavators, no electric lighting, no power tools of any kind. Men working with picks and shovels and black powder and their own 2 hands, hauling the earth out by the cartload, and in roughly 7 months they opened up a passage just over half a mile long, around 21 feet across and 17 feet high, and they lined the whole thing in brick and stone so cleanly that it would still be standing, dry and solid, well over 130 years later. They used a method called cut and cover. They tore open a massive trench down the length of the avenue, built the tunnel inside it, then roofed it over, buried it, and handed the street back to the public as if nothing at all had happened underneath. And someone had to actually do that digging. The work fell largely to immigrant labourers, many of them newly arrived from Ireland, swinging picks by the light of oil lamps in a trench that could bury them alive if the walls gave way. They were carving an open wound down the middle of a working street. Shops on either side, horses and carts trying to squeeze past, an entire neighbourhood living beside a canyon of mud and stone for months on end. There were no real safety codes. No hard hats, no inspectors, no one keeping count of the injured. Just men and tools and the constant pressure to finish before the money ran out. When you stand inside that tunnel today and run your hand along the brick, you are touching the work of people whose names almost nobody ever bothered to write down. When it opened in 1844, people called it a marvel, and they were right to. It was, and still is, widely described as the oldest tunnel of its kind ever built beneath a city street anywhere in the world. The oldest subway tunnel on the planet, decades before anything we would recognize as a subway even existed. Trains ran through it in near-total darkness, the passengers watching the tunnel mouth shrink to a small coin of light far behind them. For a while, this place was the beating heart of Brooklyn's ambition, the proof that the young city could build something the world had never seen. Remember, in 1844 the idea of deliberately travelling underground was close to unthinkable for nearly everyone. You went underground to be buried, not to commute. Cellars and mines were places of dread and danger, not somewhere you casually spent part of your day. So to willingly climb aboard a train and let it carry you into a black stone throat beneath the city, trusting that the ceiling would hold and that the far end would eventually appear, took a small act of nerve, and people did it, day after day, until it became routine. That is its own kind of marvel. Not just that they built the thing, but that they talked an entire city into riding down into the dark and thinking nothing of it. One of the people who actually rode through it was a young newspaperman named Walt Whitman, years before he became one of the most famous poets in American history. In the 1840s, Whitman was editing a Brooklyn paper and living right in the neighborhood, and he knew the tunnel firsthand. Later in his life, he wrote about it almost tenderly, remembering the strange dark ride under the city, the way the daylight vanished behind the train, and the passengers sat in a moving pocket of lantern light and shadow. To him it was already a piece of old Brooklyn, a memory worth holding on to. He had no way of knowing that within his own lifetime the whole thing would be sealed off and denied, or that a century after that people would stand on the street above it and argue that it had never existed at all. And then, less than 20 years later, they buried it. Not closed it, buried it. In 1861, the tunnel was sealed, filled in at both ends, packed solid with dirt, and walled off from the world. The official reason is one of those explanations that sounds perfectly reasonable right up until you actually look at it directly. The story goes that the state passed laws pushing steam trains out of the city streets, that a tangle of politics and money and competing railroad interests made the tunnel more trouble than it was worth, and so the company simply shut the whole thing down. That much is probably true as far as it goes. Railroad politics in that era were brutal, and there was real pressure to get the locomotives out of Brooklyn once and for all. But here is the part that never quite sits right. When a business closes down a piece of infrastructure, it usually tries to claw some value back out of it. You sell the land, you repurpose the space, you at the very least leave the door unlocked in case you ever want it again. What you do not normally do is take a half-mile stone tunnel, an engineering achievement that people once travelled across the city to see, and completely entomb it, fill it with earth, break every connection to it, then let the paperwork scatter and rot until, within a generation or two, the people living directly above it are arguing about whether it had ever been real at all. And somebody, somewhere, actually made that call. This was not weather, or an earthquake, or slow decay quietly doing its work over the centuries. A person, or a small group of people in a room, looked at one of the proudest things their city had ever produced and decided that the cleanest solution was to make it disappear, to pour the fill, brick up the ends, and simply walk away. We still do not really know the full reasoning behind it, and that is a large part of what gnaws at people, because a decision that final usually has more behind it than we are ever told, whether it was pure practicality or a way to bury a lawsuit or a feud between powerful men that ended with a tunnel as the casualty. The paperwork that might have explained it is exactly the paperwork that went missing. And what is genuinely eerie is how thorough the disappearance turned out to be. This was not simply a door getting locked and forgotten. The connections were severed, the fill was left in place. And over the following decades, the tunnel quietly dropped off the maps that should have shown it. Even the railroad's own later records grew vague about it, as if the institution that built the thing had decided it was easier to pretend it had never happened. A whole generation grew up on Atlantic Avenue, never once knowing that a cathedral of brick and stone, humming with silence, sat just beneath their morning walk to work. And so the tunnel did not just close. It fell straight out of history. The men who built it died. The records got lost, or misfiled, or quietly disposed of. The entrances vanished under new construction, and the great stone passage under Atlantic Avenue slid out of fact and into folklore. By the early 20th century, it was a ghost story, something your grandfather swore was down there, a rumour that refused to die even though nobody could actually prove it. And the rumours got stranger. During Prohibition, people whispered that bootleggers had found a way in and were using the sealed tunnel to brew and move illegal liquor hidden from the police, in a space that officially was not even there. Others said it had become a hideout, a dumping ground, a place where bodies went when somebody wanted them gone for good. And then there was the strangest legend of all, the one that would eventually pull a young engineering student down through that manhole. People swore that when the railroad sealed the tunnel, they had not bothered to drag everything out of it first. That somewhere behind those walls of packed dirt and brick, an entire steam locomotive had been left inside, sealed in, entombed with the tunnel itself, a whole machine sitting patiently in the dark. Over the years, the empty space collected stories the way an old well collects coins. Some people were convinced there was pirate treasure down there, or Civil War gold, or a fortune hidden by someone who died before they could ever dig it back up. Others were sure the tunnel connected to a whole secret network of passages under Brooklyn, and that the sealed section was only one visible piece of something much larger. None of it could be checked, and that was precisely the appeal. An unopened box under the street will always be more interesting than an open one, because as long as it stays shut, it can hold anything you are brave enough to imagine. There was even a darker thread woven through it. A story that pages torn from the diary of John Wilkes Booth, the man who assassinated Abraham Lincoln, had been hidden away inside the tunnel, tucked into the one place in the entire city that nobody would ever think to look, because nobody could remember it was there. Whether any of that was true almost did not matter. The point is that a real piece of the city had gone so completely dark that people could hang absolutely anything they wanted on it, and not a single person could say for certain they were wrong. For over a century, that is where it stayed. A locked box under the street that everyone had thrown away the key to, until 1979, when Bob Diamond, barely 20 years old, heard the legend and simply could not let it go. A story like that is easy to enjoy for a moment and then forget. Diamond did the opposite. He decided he was going to find the thing. He was a student at the Pratt Institute, an engineering kid with a stubborn streak and time on his hands, when the legend got its hooks into him. He had heard, somewhere, that there might be an old sealed tunnel under Atlantic Avenue, maybe with a locomotive still inside, and instead of treating it as a fun bit of trivia, he treated it like an engineering problem waiting to be solved. So he went digging, but not in the ground. Not yet. He went digging through old records, forgotten transit documents, brittle maps, anything at all that might show where the tunnel had truly been. He talked to old-timers. He even went through gas company records, figuring that if anyone had ever accidentally bumped into a giant hidden tunnel while laying pipe, it would be them. And the deeper he went, the more he realized the official record was a mess. Pieces did not line up. Documents flatly contradicted each other. It was almost as if the paper trail itself had been built to lead nowhere. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. But buried inside all of it, he found just enough to make an educated guess about where one of the old entrances might still be. A single spot under a manhole in the middle of Atlantic Avenue. The way down was not dramatic. It was a manhole in the middle of a busy avenue, cars whipping past on either side. But below it, the real barrier was waiting. A thick concrete bulkhead poured to seal the tunnel off, standing between Diamond and whatever lay on the other side. Getting through it meant crawling into a tight, black, airless gap and working at that concrete until a hole finally opened up, just big enough to force a body through. That is the point where a reasonable person quits. Diamond went through, and when he came out the other side and his light hit those walls, the enormous arched ceiling swallowing the beam whole, he understood that every skeptic who had ever told him he was chasing a fairy tale had been wrong. He had been right the whole time. The legend was real. The tunnel was real. And he was, as far as anyone could tell, the first human being to stand inside it in 119 years. What happened next should have been the triumphant ending to the story. And for a while, it very nearly was. The news got out. A young man had rediscovered the oldest subway tunnel in the world, sitting right under one of Brooklyn's busiest streets. The story landed in newspapers and magazines. National Geographic paid attention. Diamond founded a small organization dedicated to the tunnel and the old railway, and he started leading tours down into it, personally walking group after group down through that same manhole and into the dark, telling them the whole strange history as they stood inside it. For close to 30 years, an ordinary person could show up, climb down a hole in a Brooklyn street, and stand inside a piece of history the city had erased. He had not just found the tunnel, he had given it back. Almost everyone who went down on those tours came back describing the same handful of things. The sudden drop in temperature, the total, pressing silence, broken only by the sound of your own footsteps on the packed floor, the way the arched ceiling climbed up and away into a darkness that swallowed every flashlight beam whole. It did not feel like a basement or a sewer. It felt like a buried church, a vast, patient, man-made space that had been holding its breath since before the Civil War even ended. But the two biggest questions in the entire story never got answered, because there was still that far wall, the sealed end of the tunnel, where the legend said the locomotive was entombed. Diamond believed it was there. He believed that behind that barrier of brick and packed earth sat a 19th century steam engine, and quite possibly more, exactly where it had been abandoned, and he wanted to dig through and prove it once and for all. He wanted to bring in ground-penetrating radar, break through the final bulkhead, and finally lay eyes on whatever the city had sealed away. And that is the precise point in the story where the doors started quietly closing again, because getting permission to excavate turned into a fight that dragged on for years. Permits stalled out. Agencies that had happily ignored the tunnel for a century suddenly discovered they had very strong opinions about it. At one point there was even an attempt to settle the biggest question of all on camera, with a crew and equipment brought in to probe that final sealed wall and hunt for the rumoured locomotive behind it. And this is where the story gets truly frustrating, because it did not deliver the clean answer everyone was waiting for. The results were murky, some readings were tantalizing, others were dismissed. Nothing was fully excavated, nothing was fully proven, and the wall stayed shut. Whatever is back there, if anything is really back there, kept it secret. And the harder Diamond and others pushed to actually open that last chamber, the more resistance they seemed to run into from the very institutions that were supposed to care about preserving the city's own history. For Bob Diamond, the fight over that final wall slowly became the story of the rest of his life. He had spent his youth finding the tunnel and much of his adulthood trying to open its last secret, and instead of ending in triumph, the whole thing curdled into a long, grinding war of permits, disputes, and closed doors. The man who had handed the city back a lost wonder found himself locked in an argument with that same city over how and whether anyone could ever set foot inside it again. There is something almost cruel in the shape of that. He proved the impossible was real, and his reward was to spend decades watching the door he had personally forced open get pushed shut again, one bureaucratic inch at a time. For a lot of people, this is where a much bigger and far more uncomfortable question comes into focus. And this is where we have to step carefully, because this is where the story leaves solid ground and walks straight into the territory of theory. There is a growing community of researchers, and you have almost certainly seen their work, who look at the Atlantic Avenue tunnel and do not see a one-off oddity at all. They see a pattern. They point at it and ask a question that mainstream history tends to wave away. How many times has this actually happened? How many structures were built by people we are told did not have the tools, at a speed we are told was impossible, only to be sealed, buried, filled in, and quietly written straight out of the official story? The theory, for anyone who has never gone down this particular rabbit hole, usually runs something like this. It holds that the timeline we were all handed is not quite honest, that at some point, not nearly as long ago as we assume, there was a far more advanced world that got wiped out or covered over. Sometimes it is described as a great flood of mud that buried the lower floors of entire cities. Sometimes it is described as a deliberate reset of history. In this telling, a lot of the grand old architecture we credit to the 1800s was actually inherited rather than built, and the true story was papered over with a more convenient one. It is a big, sweeping, extraordinary claim, and extraordinary claims are supposed to earn their keep with evidence. The people who believe it will happily hand you a list. They will point to grand old buildings half sunk into the ground, with windows and doorways that disappear below the modern street level, as if an entire floor got buried and everyone simply agreed never to mention it. They will point to the enormous, ornate exhibition halls of the old world's fairs, palaces of glass and iron that took the breath away and then, strangely, were torn down almost as quickly as they went up, as though the official story needed them gone. They will point to the star-shaped stone forts that show up in nearly identical form on every continent. They will point to cathedrals and capitals and train stations so overbuilt and so beautiful that they find it hard to believe the people of that era really produced them on the timelines we are given. And when they talk about a lost era, sometimes called Tartaria, an advanced civilization they argue was scrubbed from the record, the buried tunnel under Atlantic Avenue slots neatly into their case as Exhibit A. Proof, they say, that the ground beneath a modern city can hide something enormous, and that the people in charge can be perfectly comfortable letting it stay hidden. Now, professional historians push back hard on all of this, and it is only fair to say so plainly. They will tell you the tunnel was buried for ordinary, boring reasons. Money and politics and steam laws, nothing more. They will tell you the sunken buildings are the simple result of streets being raised and grades being changed over time, not the fingerprints of a lost empire. They will tell you the 7-month construction was genuinely impressive, but not the least bit supernatural, just a lot of desperate men and cheap labour and a whole lot of black powder. And they are not wrong to demand hard evidence before anyone goes rewriting the entire past. Here is the honest, uncomfortable middle of it. You do not actually need a lost super-civilization for the core idea to keep you up at night, because the documented version is already unsettling enough on its own. Cities really are built on top of their older selves. There are genuine, verified cases of abandoned railway platforms bricked up and left behind the walls of stations that millions of people pass through every day. There are entire lower streets that got buried when a city decided to raise its ground level, with the old storefronts still standing in the dark underneath. Forgetting, on a massive scale, is not a conspiracy theory. It is simply something that cities do. The tunnel under Atlantic Avenue is just the cleanest, most undeniable example of it, the one where a single, stubborn person proved the forgetting was real by crawling straight into it. But even if you throw out every grand theory, even if you take the most cautious, skeptical, careful version of these events, you are still left staring at the hard little fact sitting at the center of all of it. A real, enormous, sophisticated piece of infrastructure was built, used, sealed, and then genuinely forgotten, not hidden away in some remote corner of the world. Forgotten under a main street in the largest city in the country for 119 years. That part is not a theory. That part actually happened. And once you know for certain it happened once, it becomes very, very hard to feel confident it only ever happened once. Which brings us to the part of the story that almost nobody ever talks about, because here is how it ends, at least for now, after all of it. After the rediscovery, after the tours, After all those years of ordinary people finally being allowed to walk down into their own buried history, the tunnel was closed again. Around 2010, the city shut it down. The official reason was safety. There were concerns about the entrance, about emergency exits, about whether it was truly responsible to keep sending people down through a manhole into a sealed space with exactly one way in and one way out. On paper, that is perfectly reasonable. But just sit with the shape of it for a moment. A tunnel gets built, then it gets buried and forgotten for over a century. One stubborn young man digs it back up and shows it to the world. For a little while, it lives again. And then, quietly, without much fuss at all, the manhole is closed, the tours come to an end, and the great stone passage under Atlantic Avenue goes dark and silent and off-limits all over again. Sealed a first time in 1861. Sealed a second time in our own lifetime. The locomotive, if it is really down there, is still down there. That final wall was never opened. The radar readings were never resolved. And the city went right back to living directly on top of a mystery it had chosen, twice now, not to solve. So what do we actually do with a story like this? You can take the careful path and decide it is nothing more than a fascinating quirk of engineering history, a forgotten tunnel, and a stubborn young man, and a pile of tall tales that grew up in the dark. That is a perfectly honest way to see it. Or you can take the harder, stranger path and let it bother you the way it has bothered everyone who ever crawled down into it. Because the tunnel is not really unsettling because of whatever might be sealed behind that last wall. It is unsettling because of what it quietly proves about memory itself. It proves that something can be enormous and real and important and still vanish completely. The official record works less like a wall and more like a curtain, and things can slip behind it and stay hidden there for entire lifetimes. A whole tunnel, under a whole city, gone from the map, gone from the books, gone from the minds of the millions of people walking over it every single day, until one person finally refused to accept that the empty space on the map was really empty. And here is the thought that really lingers, long after a story like this ends. You are almost certainly sitting or standing somewhere right now that has an understory of its own. Every old city is layered like that, built on the bones of the version that came before it, full of sealed rooms and filled-in basements and forgotten passages that nobody has any real reason to remember. The tunnel under Atlantic Avenue does not stand out because it is one of a kind. It stands out because it got caught, because one person happened to be stubborn enough to prove it was really down there. And for every tunnel that finally gets found, the uncomfortable question is how many of them never do. The tunnel under Atlantic Avenue is quiet again tonight. The traffic is still moving over it. The dust is settling back down in the dark, undisturbed, exactly the way it was before Bob Diamond ever pried that cover loose. And the last wall is still standing, still sealed, still holding on to whatever it is holding, waiting, patiently, for someone to finally ask the only question that ever really mattered. Not what did we build down there? What else have we forgotten?